So, the way we're going to run the panel is that I asked Earl and Doug and Terry, and I will introduce them in a moment, to speak really for 10 minutes, to kind of do a flash talk. What is the essence? I've been trained at TED now for a few times. That's it for the long form. And then we're going to have a conversation, and hopefully also, if we can, we'll involve you. If not, you're going to meet some of them again as the day goes forward, and you'll have the whole workshop to have a conversation with these people. So, Terry, I'm going to introduce you first. Terry Real, for any of you who don't know, is the founder of the Relational Life Institute, which you can go directly online to look for, and is actually also running a course right now on modern masculinity. So what we're going to get here is probably a nugget of the course that Terry is doing. That we've done some of it together. This is yours alone. The latest book of Terry, who's primarily, I would say, a couples therapist, but trained with Carol Ginnigan and with a number of the major feminists in our field, is The New Rules of Marriage, What You Need to Make Love Work. But his famous book, I think it's your famous book, right, is I Don't Want to Talk About It, which is probably one of the most important books to give to men in your practice and to men who maybe don't even know themselves that they are depressed. It's really a groundbreaking book. It's one that has accompanied me for years. Doug, I'm going to do the intro right now, that way it's taken care of. Doug is a sexual health author, therapist, and trainer, and you find everything about him at the Harvey Institute, which he co-founded, and it's probably one of the most enlightened material out there in working with out-of-control sexuality and in offering an alternative paradigm to the sometimes accurate and sometimes overused label of sexual addiction. And Doug Braun, B-R-A-U-N, Harvey. And it should be on your program, but just so you know. And what I asked Doug to talk to us about, Doug is primarily a group therapist who has done years and years of work with men, straight and gay men, talking about their sexual orientations, not as in orientation, just if they're interested, who they're interested in, but their erotic orientations. And I asked him to tell me, when you've listened for years to men talk about sex in a way that they've never talked about it, what do they actually talk about? So that's, and we will. And Earl Turner, Dr. Earl Turner, who's a clinical psychologist, an assistant professor at the University of Houston. And more interesting for me as well is that you're the 2019 president-elect for the Society for Child and Family Policy and Practice. And what I've asked Earl to address with us is addressing masculinities and cultures and cultural expectations in therapy. Terry's title is Leading Men Beyond Patriarchy, Masculinity Reconfigured. Go.
I want to thank... Yes.
Can you see us?
Can you hear? Is that better? Yeah, I think I will. Yeah. I want to thank Esther for inviting me, and I want to tell you I always do whatever she says, so... It's been a great relationship so far. We'll see how it goes. All right, look. How many therapists in the room? Let me see hands. Wow. How many coaches? Educators? And what I like to call normal people? Okay, great. Listen, before I start, I want you to throw out for me a few words. When you think of men, masculinity, give me a word that comes to mind. Strong. Wait, raise your hand. Go ahead. Strong. Fearless. Huh? Macho. Feminine? Who said that? Oh, you're enlightened. You can skip this one altogether. I think you're a ringer. Yeah, all the way over there. What? Okay, great. Listen, can I tell you, I've been doing this for over 20 years. Can I tell you a word I never hear? Love. Can I tell you a word I never hear? Vulnerability. Here's another one, connection. Look, with all due respect, I'm not here to make things more complicated. I'm here to make things really simple. I have one simple message, which is this. In the words of the great Harvey Milk, I am here today to recruit you. I have 10 minutes, and this is what I want to do. How many of you therapists, when you were in therapy school, learned that when you're working with a couple, the cardinal rule is, thou shalt not take sides? How many of you learned to be neutral? Come on, let me see hands. Right. Particularly, you don't take sides with the woman against the man. If you do, you have to go to your supervisor and talk about your mother for a while. All right, let me give you the big picture as I see it. The great story of the 20th century is that women have changed dramatically. Have men? Not so much. The status quo was built for men. It's in the masculine model. It suits men. Here's one open secret. I deal with, like Paul, I deal with couples for 2 days on the brink of divorce. These are extreme couples. I ask the woman to leave. I talk to the guy. You know what he says to me? Things aren't really that bad around here. If you could just kind of get her off my back. Look, here's the thing. When we say that the model of intimacy has changed, and we no longer want companionable intimacy, we want true intimacy, we want emotional intimacy, we want heart-to-heart talks, long walks on the beach, sex in our 50s and 60s and 70s, right? When we say we want this, who's the we? Think about that. It is women who are leading the charge to redefine long-term relationships. It is women who are asking for increased emotional intimacy from men. And one of the great paradoxes is that we do not raise boys and men to be emotionally intimate. Patriarchy was not built for intimacy. Patriarchy was built for production and consumption and stability. In the one-up, one-down world of patriarchy, of masculinity, there is no platform for intimacy, for same as, for connection. You're above, you're below. Dominator, dominated. Where's the platform for intimacy there? So what I'm saying is, a lot of us have heard that men are afraid of intimacy. I don't think so. I think men don't know what intimacy is. I think men are afraid of subjugation. And men read somebody coming close to them as a threat of subjugation. And if it's a man coming close to you, it's also the threat of some kind of homosexual encounter. Just looking into a man's eyes produces homophobia. What it means to be a man is to be invulnerable. The more invulnerable you are, the more manly you are. The more vulnerable you are, the more girly you are. And as Brené Brown and many of us have come to, we humans connect through our vulnerabilities. The idea that to be a real man is to be invulnerable is a lie. We are not invulnerable as human beings. I tell the guys I work with, trying to run away from your vulnerability is like trying to run away from your rectum. It has a way of following you wherever you go. The other thing I want to say is living up to this myth of invulnerability, of being in charge of what you're not in charge of, is a lie. It's a lie that all men perform to. What does this mean? All men have inadequacy and shame because we're all living a lie. Okay, now here's what I want to say to us therapists. Women across the board are carrying the dissatisfaction for intimacy. It is women who are here. It is women who run the self-help industry. It is women who bring... Look, if I had a nickel for every guy who brought his woman in to see me because they weren't intimate, I would not be retired, okay? It's women who bring in men, or men bring themselves in because the women are fed up with them. 70, 80% of divorce is instituted by women. It's women who are carrying the dissatisfaction. Women bring men into us, therapists and coaches, so that we can help them learn to be more relational, so that we can help them be more sufferable, listen, be vulnerable, open up, share your feelings. These are all, under traditional patriarchy, coded as feminine. What we've done as a field is we've backed off. We've said, hey, we're a gender-neutral situation. We don't favor women over men. We like men around. Come here. Open your heart. Talk about your feelings and articulate your vulnerabilities. That's man? No. In the work that I do, we put it on the table. Esther said it very well. Somebody sort of summarized my work as women have had a revolution, and now men have to deal with it. And that's true. We do have to deal with it. The cultural response, look at what's happening politically right now. The cultural response has been a massive backlash. If women would only go back to the 50s, all would be well. I don't want women to stand down. I want men to stand up and meet these new demands. And I want us therapists to throw our weight behind these new demands. Ready? Women are right. Women are right. Go ahead, give it to yourself. Look, what you're asking for, new levels of emotional intimacy, is right. We're therapists. We belong here. We believe in intimacy. What I say to the guys is, Harry, you're a statistic, man. There are hundreds of thousands of you being brought to offices just like me. We cannot blame your mother. I'm sorry. We can't do it. Listen. I want men to stand up and meet these new demands of intimacy. I want us to move into vulnerability, open our hearts, learn to listen. There are some basic skills that it would do us well to learn. And what I say to Harry is, roll up your sleeves. It will be in your interest to learn how to do this. I am not neutral. The women's delivery may suck, by the way. And I talk to women about speaking the truth with love, speaking up with love. Because under patriarchy, you can be connected or you can be powerful, but you can't be both at the same time.
Say that again.
Yes. Under patriarchy, you can be affiliative, connected, that's feminine. You can be powerful, that's quote-unquote masculine. You cannot unite the two. So for a woman to speak to a man with firm, loving voice is a revolution. For a man to open up his heart and listen to a woman with firm, loving voice and not get defensive or protective, that is a revolution. And what I'm telling you is that leading men and women into real intimacy is synonymous with leading them beyond patriarchy. Don't be neutral. This is not a matter of opinion. The research is completely clear. The research is completely clear. Egalitarian marriages breed happier, healthier, less anxious, less depressed people than traditional hierarchical marriage. Hierarchical leadership doesn't work in corporations anymore. Hierarchical leadership doesn't work anywhere but in Washington, D.C. And we're going to do our best about that. Look, masculinity is at war with itself right now. There's a traditional patriarchal model that's hierarchical, one-up. We all know the drill. There's a new modern model, which is ecological. The essential mistake of patriarchy is dominion, power over, whether it's power over nature or your wife or your kids or your own body. Power over instead of cooperation and power with. There's a new relational, ecological world out there that cures the essential delusion of dominance and power. We are not in control of much of anything but ourselves on a good day. We therapists throw our weight behind this revolution. It's not only our privilege to do it, it's our obligation to do it. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of life and death. Thank you. Go.
No. And actually, I want to make it explicit why I don't want to stand.
Because I'm sitting here thinking how I've learned listening to men for the last 30 years talk about their erotic lives. And I've learned from men by sitting with them, not standing. So this is how I'm going to channel what I know, by sitting. This is what I do. I sit with men. I'll sit a little bit more forward. I can do that. But I sit with men. This is how my body is when I'm with men and they talk about their erotic lives. I'm just sitting with them. And this is one of the things I do with them. I let them sit quietly, thinking about their erotic lives. I'd like to operationalize what we've just heard from Terry so brilliantly. I think one of the ways I operationalize what Terry invited us to do was I operationalize deconstructing all of the narratives that Terry so artfully described are in the air we breathe, is by asking men to understand their vision of sexual health. I ask men, what is your vision of sexual health? And they look at me like, and I pay you for this? Somebody said earlier, it's not so important that we know the answer, it's that we're interested in the question. I find men are very interested in sexual health conversations. I was talking with somebody on the break. Men are very concerned about talking about sex, and they're very concerned about talking about sexuality. Because when you ask them about sex and sexuality, their minds go to which body part goes in which orifice, in which situation, and in which context. And how are you going to judge me for that? Sexual health is a principal way of living in the world. And men, I find, are very interested in living a principled sexual life. This is something that interests them. What I believe is men pay a very high price to have access to these conversations. One of the things I like to say is men get access to sexual health conversations because they've been sexually abused, they've sexually offended, or they're addicted to sex. Other than that, we're not really that interested in the sexual health of men's lives. And they have to pay a ticket through one of those windows to get access to one of us who may be interested in their sexual health. That's a very big price for men have to pay. To have somebody interested in helping them become sexually literate, sexually health knowledgeable, and understand who they want to be as a human being on the planet when it comes to their sexual health. That's a pretty big price. So I'm very interested in how our profession can be a contact point for sexual health conversations. And that that we think of psychotherapy as a place for a sexual health conversation to occur. I'll talk in the afternoon about what I mean by sexual health conversations. I want to give you a little bit of the idea of what I believe happens when men are invited into the world of telling us about who they are erotically. I'll tell a story of a man who was married for many years. I'm not going to go into too many details. This is going all around the world. So how do you tell a story about somebody you've heard from somebody else in a clinical hour without them sitting there listening to this tape going, he's talking about me? So I'm going to do my best. This man was married for quite some time. He had a very, very specific erotic interest that was deeply meaningful to him. Deeply meaningful. But if he were to tell, this is a cisgendered, heterosexual white man in a marriage, and if he told the person he loved what he most erotically desired, he would not be a man. And not being a man in front of the person you love, when not being a man is about what you erotically desire, I find is one of the most avoided conversations men avoid. What I like to tell couples therapists, I don't do couples work. I'm a group therapist, and I do individual work. I'm primarily a group therapist. You can see, like I'm doing this, right? You're like my group. What I like to tell couples therapists in particular, if you want someone to know who their partner is, have your client tell their partner who they are erotically. If I really want to know who I am in a relationship with, I need to tell my partner who I am erotically. When I tell my partner who I am erotically, I will find more out about my partner. And I may find out things I don't want to know about my partner. I might know what my partner looks like with a feeling of disgust. I might know this person who loves me more than any person on the planet. The minute I tell them who I am erotically, they will look at me as if I am a total stranger to them. When I tell somebody who I am erotically, it may be the first time they have ever said aloud, what I like to say, they felt their cheek muscles move and they looked in the eye of another person as they described who they are erotically as a human being. Somebody said earlier, these are conversations oftentimes we're witnessing not in an open way, finally it's being released, it's actually being created in front of us. And this is often what will happen with men when they talk about their erotic lives. These are not suppressed conversations. These are not withheld stories. These are actually moments where men for the first time are defining something about themselves that they had a vague sense of, but didn't quite understand. And one of the errors I see when erotic conversations enter couples is the perception that this erotic disclosure was a secret. You kept this from me. And that may be true for some, but I find for many of the men I work with, they may know the sex act they want to engage in, but they have never talked about what it means to them. The erotic is the world of meaning that we place on sex. Sexual activity is something we enjoy for pleasure. So one's erotic orientation is the meaning of the engagement of a sexual experience with oneself or another, or others. And so my hope for you today is that we accept the fact that our field is erotically illiterate. We are an erotically illiterate profession. And I'd like you to think about how you function as a therapist when you're faced with the reality that I know so little about this, and it's everything I need to know in order to help the person in front of me. These are not moments we like as a therapist. And yet, our clients want this from us. Esther, I remember when I first met you in San Diego, we were having this conversation, and I said to you, Esther, do you think couples therapists are sex therapists? And you said, I think so. And I challenged you, and I said, I don't think so. I don't think the couples therapy profession is an erotically informed clinical method. And so I really hope that you have a moment today, just a moment, where you might let in a piece of information that you realize, I know nothing about that. And get interested. Get interested in the idea that you have an erotic life, your clients have an erotic life, and when we don't engage our clients in their erotic world, we're keeping them from knowing each other.
I'll move up also. So I'm not great at giving TED Talk style, so I'm going to look at my notes so that I can at least stay a little bit on track, so that I don't ramble. It's been a lot of great things talked about today, and so as I've been sitting here, I've been trying to now sort of rethink some of the things that I was going to talk about, but I think it's important for us to sort of reflect on all of the conversations that have been had today. Specifically get around towards when we think about men and masculinity, is that these are things that they've been socialized how to behave, and sort of they have expectations about themselves regarding masculinity and those ideals. But I think society has expectations, as well as women in their lives have expectations, and so a lot of times those sort of shape their behaviors in a lot of interactions. So I want to talk mostly sort of from a cultural perspective in terms of thinking about men and masculinity and about how therapists engage with men in terms of their work. So as was mentioned, I work primarily with families and couples, and I think a lot of things that have been talked about today is that for men, this idea of being vulnerable is challenging. So it's almost a double-edged sword, because you're not taught to be sort of vulnerable and express affection most of the time. But then when you are an adult male, you are sort of expected to engage in those actions, and I think that's why for a lot of relationships it's difficult when you go to therapy. As a couple, men are resistant to being able to go to couples therapy and engage in a conversation because they may not know what the expectations are about that therapy relationship. There may also be a lot of fears about being vulnerable and sort of losing that sense of power. And so this was sort of mentioned a couple of times today about this idea of power, and that men are taught to sort of be powerful and take command of a lot of different situations. And when you're in a therapy setting, you sort of lose that sense of power. You're not the person that's in control of sort of the conversation and where the conversation goes. And oftentimes it is the female partner in the couple relationship that oftentimes sort of sets up the stage for let's go to therapy and let's talk about these things. And I think sometimes as therapists, although we are taught not to sort of take sides, I think we sort of have this inherent bias sometimes to be more biased towards sort of the female partner in that couple, and also sort of support her ideals and sort of take this stance that we have to teach men how to express their emotions. And I think we sort of need to be in the sense of that we need to allow men to open up to us. And so one of the things that I often talk about is that we have to meet men where they are in terms of couples therapy. And I think sometimes that issue in terms of talking about relationships is that it's a forced conversation where the female partner may sort of say, I need you to express your emotions more. The therapist then sort of brings up these questions about, insecurities about talking about emotions or being soft or not sort of being overly masculine. And that's a conversation I think we need to sort of back off and allow men the opportunity to talk about those emotions. So I like some of the clips that were shown today in terms of when you look at men and sort of, I think maybe the last clip with the group of men that were talking is that when you give them that space to be vulnerable, is that they really do have the capacity to be able to open up and express emotions and be supportive of each other in terms of those spaces. But when it's not just a room full of men, sort of you get different behaviors because they do have to live up to some expectation that society has in terms of them and their sort of masculine traits. Sort of from a cultural perspective, as I said, I was going to look at my notes now. My screen is blank. From a cultural perspective, I think one of the things that a lot of the research and literature talks about is that certain groups are not as masculine in terms of their traits. And so specifically when we think about Asian American men, oftentimes it's discussed that, they tend to be more feminine. But when we look at the research, it is this idea that even for Asian American men, they still have a strong belief in a lot of those masculine traits, but it's the way that they're perceived by society that really sort of, has this bias towards them in terms of their masculinity. But one of the things that often does notice that specifically for African American men is that they tend to report the most masculine sort of ideals in terms of masculinity, and sort of that shapes a lot in terms of how they are in relationships, how they're viewed by their therapist. I think we can all, again, talk about how we may not be biased, but they tend to be perceived as threatening, regardless of how they are in different spaces. And when they don't sort of live up to those ideas, then they're perceived as, not being a real man, in quotation marks. And so I think those are the challenges that they really face in terms of, if I'm in a therapy relationship, I can't express these emotions even in front of my partner, because then, even though the conversation is about sort of intimacy, in the back of that female partner's mind, potentially, you still sort of look at him differently, or he may be perceived as you looking at him differently because he has that capacity to sort of express emotions. And sort of the other piece that I want to add to that is that when you're in a sort of dyad, particularly from the therapist dyad working across cultural, racial groups, is that sort of adds another barrier to that intimacy in terms of the relationship and having those discussions about masculinity, because I think certain men from certain groups may not want to, again, sort of open up and disclose those things when they're working with someone who doesn't look like them, because that, again, you have to think about that sort of cultural lens that they're coming from. And just a brief story, I recently was interacting with an African-American male and sort of talking about, his ideas with expressing emotions and feelings, is that, he had to maintain this really stoic presence, not just for himself, but because of how others sort of perceived him, and that he had all of those feelings in terms of, sadness and thinking about his childhood and trauma that he's experienced. But you can't really discuss those traumatic experiences because you are viewed differently by others. You may have to sort of maintain, particularly from a cultural perspective, African-American families, there's a lot of things that you have to keep within your home. And so if you talk about those sort of traumatic experiences, then it opens up, not just about yourself, but also your family history in those particular situations. And so when you talk about sexual health, sexual trauma, the subject that was touched on earlier today about sort of men can be vulnerable in their childhood, they can sort of be abused, but as an adult, they can't sort of, you can't be sexually assaulted as an adult male. And I think those are experiences that we sort of have to really sort of be more open in terms of allowing men to be able to express those feelings, and when they are in those situations, that it is uncomfortable to be able to talk about those things. And so I think as a therapist, it's sometimes hard to deal with silence in the room. And I think in order to really foster that relationship, to allow men to be able to open up, is that you have to get comfortable with that silence. And so you may have to sit for a while and just allow him to be able to get to the place where he can be able to open up about those emotions and feelings that he may have. And you may have to sort of step in and use your power as a therapist to be able to let the other partner know that they also need to sort of pause for a second, because I think sometimes that partner may sort of jump into the situation and really try to engage them and really exploring those emotions where they may not be at a space to really talk about those things until they really get comfortable with being in that therapy environment to be able to talk about those things. And so I think it's really important that you as a therapist understand that men are complex, and I think the videos that we watched today really highlighted all of those things, but oftentimes society doesn't view men as being complex, is that you have to be a certain way, and when you live outside of those norms or outside of that box, then it's not only difficult for you to be able to express those things, but it's difficult for maybe the people in your life to also recognize that you have those other vulnerabilities and feelings that you can be able to express as well. So I think I'm going to stop, and we'll give some extra time for questions. I'm a little bit off my time. To look at my screen. Let's see, is there anything that I really want to sort of touch on that I hadn't, I guess, noted? So I think one thing that I want to talk about is terms of like emotional language. I think that men do have that emotional language. I think, again, it goes back to the idea that being in a therapy situation, even in a relationship, is that what is the expectations about me being able to use my emotional language? And is is my partner going to be open to me being able to sort of talk about those things and be supported? I think one of the things that really stuck out for me in the video earlier when the couple was talking about when the man was asking if she faked an orgasm, and she's laughing, and so in the back of my mind was going through, what is he thinking about, and how is that sort of influencing and shaping his perceptions about the feelings, and really her not maybe taking him serious in that particular situation, because for her it was just like, it wasn't a big deal, but you can tell clearly it was something that was really important for him. And so to be able to open up and talk about those things, there is a double standard when it comes to men and talking about masculinity and being vulnerable.
Okay. I have never led a panel. I've always been on one. I've never led a panel. It's actually really intimidating. What did you do? So, but I'll tell you the thought that occurred to me, particularly when you, Terry, and Earl were talking. And that I would like to address. You're talking about the challenge for men to engage with their emotional lives. You're saying that they have it, you have to wait for it, you have to be patient, you have to let it emerge, you have to make it clear that it won't be used against them and all of that. What I would like to ask you actually is, I don't know if that's the right first question, but it's one I thought about, is in the case of hetero relationships, to address the ambivalence of the female partner, who on the one hand says, I want you soft, but not too soft. I want you soft, but don't crumble in front of me. Because I too, on some level, need you to be strong. I need to know I can rely on you. I need to know, even if the reliance is different from what it used to be. And I would like, when you said it's the women who lead, the women say we want, but I know you work with the women who can't receive what these men put out. This woman who laughs, I mean, what would you, we could have a supervision session on that. What do we do at that moment, And do we tell her, do you have any sense, or do you wonder, or are you curious about how he registers your laughter? What it is doing to him? And if you see at one point his face starts to smile, and then he realizes, because she's laughing, and the typical thing we do when we see someone laugh is to laugh with them. And then he realizes that the laughter is at him, and he goes from this smile to the complete cringe. I don't know if it's a very particular moment so I would like to talk about what I want and the consequences for getting the very thing that I say I want, which I may not want that much of in the first place. Dynamic we know in couples.
Sure. So I think as a therapist, I think one thing that was talked about earlier today is that I do like the idea of talking with couples specifically about what their fantasy is. And so I think that's a good way of trying to understand how she may handle some of that ambivalence about, being, soft but not too soft. Is having that conversation about what is your ideal about how you would like your partner to be in terms of, this softness. Like, what is your ideal fantasy in terms of when is it okay for him to, to crumble or get a little bit softer, and when is it not? Because I think you do send conflicting messages to men when you're in that sort of space, when you want them to be emotional, but then they can't be too emotional.
Most of the men that I meet are good-hearted, well-intended, and bewildered. They remind me of, there's an ancient Sumerian poem where a guy's about to go into battle and he says to the gods, I'll give you what you want. Just tell me what it is. And I want to tell you a story. It kills me, by the way, when people refer to my work as I'm feminizing men. That drives me nuts. I'm not interested in feminizing men. I'm interested in whole human beings. I'm interested in strong, big-hearted men, just like we're interested in sexy, smart women. You can be everything. But we don't know that. And the other thing I want to say is women participate in patriarchy just as much as men do. Women have the same code for men, so it's hard. I want to quote you. You can deny the quote if you want, but I always quote Esther. Women, she says, we like between the sheets what we protest in the streets. It always does well when I quote her. It's great. All right, now look, I want to tell you a story. This is my story. I was in Tanzania in Maasai land, and I had the privilege in a very remote village with these are real warriors. I mean, with the ears down here and the spears and the whole thing. And for 3 days, I had a men's group with the elders. They went from English to Swahili to Maasai to Swahili. And we talked about all kinds of things, women and God. But I asked them about men. And I said, in America, there's a division right now. There are people who think that a good Morani, a good warrior, a good man, is strong and tough. And there are people who think that a good Morani is sweet and sensitive. Which is it? What do you guys think? And this guy spoke to me. He was about 4'3". Blah, 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 blah. And here's what he said. I have no interest in talking to you about what makes a good Morani. I'm only interested in talking to you about what makes a great Morani. He said, now look, when the moment calls for tenderness, a good Morani will lay down his shield and be sweet like a baby. When the moment calls for fierceness, a good Morani is a killer. A great Morani is a man who knows which moment is which. I think I'll leave it there.
May I make a comment?
Of course.
Because there's something that's in the air I just want to make a comment about. And that is when the scene we saw between the couple and the fake orgasm. I talk with men about this, that the orgasm is a way to end a sexual situation in which you don't have the assertiveness to be honest in what you actually want to happen in the moment. Orgasm is shorthand for a lot of things. I work with men who have sex with men who are in hookup situations. And oftentimes they don't know how to negotiate these sexual situations with people they're just meeting. And the orgasm becomes the way to end the undesirable sexual situation. So what men learn how to do is they actually learn how to have an orgasm with somebody they're not attracted to, they're not interested in, but I'll have an orgasm with you because then I get to leave without shame and without danger. I invite you to think about, as I was listening to this woman in the tape talk about her pretending to have an orgasm with this man, and what is her narrative? How did she come to resolve a problem with this solution? And the laughter I saw as a human being having absolutely never taken a breath on the planet when such a thing was expected of her to speak and to listen to. And she was on camera. So look at the steps people have to go to have a sexual health conversation. They sign up for a television show. No. These are the lengths people go to have the privilege of a sexual health conversation. They are not unconsciously aware of what they're doing. So I just invite you all to think about how much people want these conversations, they're looking for places to have them, and they don't know who will help them.
I want to ask you a question, Doug, about, you've made a very beautiful distinction between sex and eroticism, right? Between the act and the meaning of the act. And you said something that reminded me of a sentence my mother used to say. She used to say, tell me who are your friends and I'll tell you who you are. And you say, tell me about you sexually and I'll tell you who you are. That it reveals facets about you that are rather inaccessible in any other way because it's a beautiful poetic code language for a host of other things. And I would like for you to talk more about that.
Well, with the men I work with, they assume the geography of their sex is the narrative of their sex. where the body is positioned, which body part is being pleasured by which other kind of body part, and all of these sort of the geography, the physicality of it, is erroneously thought to be the meaning of it. And so oftentimes, a man finds out the absolute favorite thing he loves sexually is to have a finger placed up his butt to rub his prostate while he has an erect penis right before he has an orgasm. And then he has an orgasm. Now, people all over the world are hearing about this lovely experience. And this man has lived his entire life ashamed of ever letting a sexual partner know this is absolutely the most meaningful experience he has with a partner sexually. To ask for this, to have the partner lovingly and joyfully engage in this activity and want to see the pleasure on the partner as this is happening, and having them both enjoy this experience of pleasure together. How do you have this if you don't request the details? One of the things I really encourage people to do is to separate out the details of a sexual act with the details of the meaning of it. And people don't have the language for the details of the meaning. They do not have this language. I love how people are saying you have to sit quietly and let men think about it. I'll give you a sex therapy tip for men. They like to get out of being vulnerable by telling you they don't know the answer to the question. It's a clever trick. They do it in my men's groups all the time. I'll ask them and say, I don't know. And I say, guess 20 times and they can be wrong. It's okay. Just guess. I'm more interested in the guess than the accuracy. And when I give them permission to guess rather than be accurate, they come up with these beautiful things. And I'll say, okay, how was that? Is that pretty accurate? Oh, yeah, that was really accurate, right? But so it's not that they don't know. That is not that they don't know. They're afraid of how you're going to react. When you give them permission to not know, you open a neural pathway that is kind of interesting for them to find their voice.
Not only they're afraid of how you're going to react, but they're also, on some level, afraid of what this may mean even for them. And the discrepancy between what they want to be and what they are. And so there's something that I'm going to quote you, that you have said. It's not the exact quote, but you've spoken about, the way I translated it is that when you look at relational wounds or relational traumas, there is a way of looking at it that would say, if whatever happens to women, when it happens to men, it's almost worse. Because he has nowhere to go, because he doesn't even know that it is meant, sometimes he's not even aware of the wound itself.
That's true. Look, the research is really clear. The wound to girls and women, if you read Carol Gilligan and the feminist research, is 11, 12, 13. As they move into womanhood, they lose their voice. And the healing work, although 50 years of feminism has changed things, but the healing work by and large for girls and women is re-empowerment, refining their voice. I want women to find loving voice, not shrill voice. No. Listen, I make a distinction between personal empowerment and relational empowerment. Personal versus relational empowerment. Personal empowerment, which is really big for therapists, 12-step, a lot of feminist groups, I summarize as, I was weak, now I'm strong, go screw yourself. Relational empowerment is, I was weak, now I'm strong. I'm bringing my strength into this relationship. I'm standing toe-to-toe with you. I'm telling you the truth. How can I help you? Let's work on this together. And it's got a completely different energy. Remember earlier I said that under patriarchy you can either be connected or you can be powerful? Okay, now I'm going to get into a lot of trouble for this one, but I'm going to say it. Early 70s feminism moved from disempowerment to empowerment. It lost the relationship. It lost the relationship to men. And I believe that relational empowerment, which is both strong and loving, is the next step for women and the next step for the feminist movement. I really do. Men have to come back in.
Can I just get a sense from the timekeepers where I am? Where is Nick or Lindsay or... Because this thing is weird. It keeps giving me fake news, that's all I can say. Does anybody know? When did we start? So it's been an hour. Not yet. 10 more minutes. Fantastic. Great. 10, 10, 10, 10, 10. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, I just was worried. I want to ask you, Earl, because in the way we've until now we take men, women. We haven't done much locating men and women in any religious, racial, or cultural or economic context. We've kind of left that a little bit on the side. And I don't want you, because you are the man of color here, to think you're the only one who has to talk about it. But I also don't want us to not talk about it, And do you? One of the things that you were saying is that there's a certain kind of danger to the vulnerability of African American men that is even bigger, and that is something that we need to be even more aware of in the context of the therapy. Did I hear you correctly? Okay, say more.
Well, I think part of it is that society has a certain view about how men should behave, and then they have certain negative views about black men in terms of their toughness. So where white men can be tough and have a certain sort of presence, if a black man does the same thing, it's perceived significantly more negative. And so I think for black men in relationships and in their community is that when you are not sort of this tough guy persona that you are expected to have, that it also impacts you personally in terms of who you are as a person. And so I think it's being able to sort of struggle within yourself about how you can, on some level, be vulnerable and express your feelings and talk about those things. But I think you have to think about the context. And so I think it's situational. In certain contexts, you can be more vulnerable and talk about those things. And so this sort of concept of locker room talk for men is that you will get men that will be more vulnerable in a group of men and talk about those things and emotions or about relationships, then they may have those conversations with their partners. And so I think when you're in a therapy relationship, that it may be more difficult for them to have those conversations. One, because their partner is present, and so they may not feel comfortable being able to sort of express their vulnerability. But I think also that the therapist also has an influence in terms of sort of shaping that relationship. And so I think as a therapist, you have to also be willing to sort of guide that conversation a little bit more.
What's one thing you do?
So I think for me, being able to, I would lean in terms of like the dyad and make sure that I may sort of connect more with the male partner. And I know we
Here's your couple.
that we don't want to sort of take sides in that relationship, but you also I tend to I want to hear from the man's perspective first and then hear from the woman, so that opens it up more so that he's not feeling like she's expressing a certain viewpoint and sort of shaping that conversation, but he has a little bit more of an opportunity to be able to sort of guide where the conversation goes. And so for me, allowing the man to speak and sort of talk about those things, it sort of lets him hear himself, but also lets his partner hear him. And so that may sort of put down some of those walls for her in terms of being able to not be as defensive, I guess, in terms of how she may respond to some of his vulnerability.
We have a few minutes for you to ask questions to the panel. Yeah. A question is a question.
Yes, it's a question.
Stand up.
I wonder if either of you can address the political systems that enable the limitations in men living a more complex and authentic life, and what would be a couple of important public policies that we could push for.
I'm working on a project right now in San Antonio, Texas, a 5-year grant, where we're changing HIV testing from a public health interaction to a sexual health conversation. What if, when somebody takes the time to show up for a public health intervention, such as, do I have an HIV virus in my body or sexually transmitted infection? What if we were less interested in tracking where you might be putting your virus to endanger other people? That's a public health transaction. What if we were to change that to, here's an opportunity to help you understand your sexual health. Bravo, you've come to us. We're interested in knowing about your sexual health. We want to teach you about what we mean by sexual health. And we're going to use this 30 minutes while you're being tested to know your relationship with HIV as an opportunity to understand what we mean by sexual health and for you to get a glimpse of where you stand with your own sexual health. Oh, and by the way, you'll learn your relationship with HIV at the end of this 30 minutes. That's a sexual health intervention rather than a public health intervention. And I think that deconstructs some of the masculinity scripts out there of men being people we have to be concerned about and harming us, that when men show up to be responsible for possibly knowing where this virus may be to not harm other people, we're actually interested in them rather than how they might harm somebody else.
My vote is that, look, under in the binary of patriarchy, intimacy, it's probably my wife, hold on. I apologize. Under the binary of patriarchy, intimacy itself is coded as feminine. And we do with intimacy what we do with many things feminine. We idealize it in principle and devalue it in fact. So let's have some daycare. Let's have some paternity leave. Let's have some systemic support for intimacy in the family. The other thing I want is I want relational skills taught in elementary school, middle school, and high school.
So I agree with the last point that you said. I think we do have to start young in teaching boys how to express their emotions. I think working with families specifically, that oftentimes if you have a young boy that if he falls and hurts himself, toughen up. We don't say, oh, are you okay? Or give him that language to really talk about those feelings. So I think we do have to sort of start young with really fostering, the conversation about talking about feelings and emotions, and that you can have a range of emotions outside of anger, because that's the only comfortable emotion that boys are able to express is anger. And so I think we have to start there.
Hi. So my question actually was about anger, and I work with young boys, so I may see this more than it comes up in adult therapy. But I was wondering, because anger does seem to be the primary emotion, I'm wondering if earlier in your work with men, all of the emotions come through as anger, and that's what you're confronted with in the work, and how you move from anger into underlying feelings of hurt or shame or guilt, and how to make that jump comfortable.
Can I just tell a story? I used to work with adolescents in the 80s. That was the way I made a living, talking to teenagers as a younger adult. And I remember I was on a playground, I think it was a basketball court with some teenagers, and I was a mental health frontline person when I took them on field trips. And we're out there and we're playing a game, and one of the boys, he was maybe 13 at the time, became so enraged and furious with me. And I watched his entire body just tense up like this, and he looked at me with such rage, and within seconds I know he was going to hit me. And I looked at him and I said, "Do you want to hit me?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Why?" And no, I didn't say, "Do you want to hit me?" I said, "Do you think I'm going to hit you?" That's what I asked him. And he said, "Yes." And I looked at him and I said, "I'm so glad you told me. That's not going to happen here." And he started crying. I had to be curious about his anger as much as I'd be curious about why he wants a cheeseburger.
In the current system, men are allowed two feelings, anger and lust. That's it. And I work with men very concretely. I'll hand you a list of 7 feelings: joy, pain, anger, fear, shame, guilt. And I'll say to you, what are you feeling right now? Oh, I'm feeling some this. Where is it in your body? It's in my belly. What's the belly say? I guess the message. And what else are you feeling? I lead men. Men need us to be mentors to them. Men do not need hand-holding and nurture. They need information about how to do this well. And they need the structure and the belief that they can do this well. One of my favorite quotes is the poet Goethe: "If you treat a man as he ought to be, he may become who he ought to be." I think we should keep our expectations high.
Thank you. Thank you, every one of you. Thank you all.